Alright, Chapter 7, Video 1. So we're going to be talking about the Articles of Confederation and the kind of government that was set up there. And we know going into it that it's not going to be good, and that's why it doesn't last. We're going to shift over to the Constitution. But I want to talk first about the Confederation Congress. Remember, this is the only national body that there is. Remember, there is no president like we have today, no court system at the national level like a Supreme Court like we have today. This Confederation Congress had its power limited. Remember, it can't tax, so it has no money. It could make treaties, but it couldn't enforce any treaties. It's a president, it's an executive branch who enforces the law, and there was no executive branch. This Confederation Congress had to borrow money if it was going to have any money, but then it would have to borrow money to pay that back. Right? So you'd have a situation of borrowing from one state to pay back another state, and it continuing on and on. The Confederation Congress could declare war, but so could each state. It could declare peace, but so could each state. It could coin money, but so could each state. And each state did coin their own money. The Confederation Congress did run the post office and deal with Native American affairs, but it can't regulate commerce from one state to another, and it's hard for it to change. There were 13 states. It took 9 of the 13 states to pass a law. And if you wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, you needed all 13 states to agree to it. And that's never going to happen. And the way it worked, each state got one vote, whether you were itty-bitty Rhode Island or very large New York. It didn't matter how big or how small. You got one vote. So this time period under the Articles of Confederation is called the critical period, with very little unity, very little way to resolve conflict. It is not all bad news, though. There were 2 laws passed under the Articles of Confederation that are seen as successes, and by that I mean we keep them even when we end up with a constitution. We keep these 2 laws. One was the Land Ordinance of 1785, and it determined how public land would be sold. There's a vast amount of land in the country that didn't belong to any individual. And so it worked out the policy for how that land would be sold. And at that point in time, it was in 640-acre plots. There was another law passed called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And it determined the steps that an area would take if they wanted to become a territory officially, and then if they wanted to become a state. And the law said that when your population reached 5,000, you could become a territory and get a territorial governor. When your population reached 60,000, you could apply to become a state. And this will be done with the Northwest region, the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But there were a lot of economic problems under the Articles of Confederation. The British were flooding our markets with their goods, which were made cheaper, and so they were sold a great deal cheaper. And it made American goods very hard, and early American manufacturers and so forth made it very hard for them to compete. We'll see our unemployment rise, and we'll enter into a bit of a depression as well. You also see states fighting with each other over taxes and so forth that they treated like tariffs. And each state was coining its own money, and there were always conflicts about the exchange of money at the border and whether or not everybody got their fair amount. There were diplomatic problems as well. For example, both the British and the Spanish were keeping military posts on our land, and we had told them to get out, and they had said, "Make me." And we couldn't make them get off our land. And they were keeping Indians stirred up against us as well. Then the Spanish governor of Louisiana is going to close off the Mississippi River to us. We were not allowed to use the Mississippi River to any trade, and we couldn't do anything to stop that from happening. Our biggest problems, though, were with the British. The British wouldn't send us an ambassador for us to work these problems out. In fact, when we asked them to do so, they kind of mockingly said, well, should we send 1 or should we send 13? And in a way, they were kind of right, because we were acting like 13 different little countries. The British had also tried to lure New Hampshire out of the United States and into Canada. They kept troops in Detroit. We had told them to leave. They wouldn't leave. They were paying Native Americans to attack us. They were sending agents into Kentucky and Ohio and trying to get folks there to rejoin the British Empire, and so on and so on. And we really didn't have a good national way to deal with these problems. Now, we are going to see some progress here in what's called the Mount Vernon Conference. This is in 1785. Virginia and Maryland were fighting with each other over some boundary issues and some other economic problems. And so George Washington is going to invite representatives of both Virginia and Maryland to his house at Mount Vernon, right? Brings these folks together at Mount Vernon. They're going to work out their problems very quickly. And they're going to say, that was so easy. Why don't we do this at a national level? So they tried it. James Madison is going to be the person who suggests this next meeting. And so the next meeting will be in Maryland, and it's called the Annapolis Convention. This was in 1786, and every state was invited to come to Annapolis to work out the problems, but only 5 states came. And that wasn't enough to accomplish the goals that they had set for dealing with national issues. So a representative from New York named Alexander Hamilton is going to suggest meeting the following year in Philadelphia. His hope was that the southern states would have an easier time getting to Philadelphia and would come to that meeting when they hadn't come to Annapolis. Now, if you look at a map, there's not a big difference between traveling to Annapolis and traveling to Philadelphia. So something must have happened to make these southern states go to Philadelphia. And that something was Shays' Rebellion. What had happened in 1780 in Massachusetts, the government had started some pretty high taxes to pay off their war debt. The war debt was pretty much owed to wealthy people in Boston, so the taxes will fall on poorer farmers to pay back wealthy people in Boston, and it rubbed those farmers the wrong way. And a so-called army of them, roughly 1,200 of them, led by Daniel Shays, will head toward a federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. These folks, these parts of the rebellion, want a better monetary policy. They want to be able to use corn and wheat as money because there wasn't enough money in circulation. They wanted to postpone paying their taxes until the Depression was over and they had a little bit more money. But they had some identifiable goals here. But the big aspect about it was there wasn't anybody to stop this rebellion. So you have an army of farmers headed toward a city in Massachusetts, and there was no national army to stop them. The Confederation Congress had the right to build an army. They just didn't have the money to build an army because there were no taxes. So there's no national army to stop them. When the Massachusetts government tried to call out the Massachusetts militia, a lot of them sided with the farmers. So they didn't want to stop the rebellion. What ends up happening is some of the wealthy people in Massachusetts are going to pull together their money and hire some people to stop this rebellion. And it's going to send ripples of fear throughout the colonies because it was the idea that we are headed to anarchy. This government is not working and everything might be about to explode if something isn't done. And that will bring people to Philadelphia.